In this presentation, I want to explore the cultural role of sexuality. We'll examine some of the following questions. What is sexuality and where does it come from? What is the scope of human sexuality when seen in a global perspective? How has sexuality been constructed in the United States? How is sexuality an arena for working out relations of power? And how does globalization influence local expressions of sexuality? Before we turn to these questions, I'd like to share two brief stories of transgendered individuals from a New York Times series. People speak in their own words. My name is Jessica Nicole Phillips. I would like to share with you a story of great personal triumph, telling how I overcame the odds and became the person I was always meant to be, but I can't. You see, I live in a small town in West Georgia, about an hour away from downtown Atlanta, and unfortunately people are not the most open-minded here. I've lost 2 jobs in the last 2 years and have been unemployed since December of last year. I know both jobs got rid of me because of my gender identity. The problem is that a lot of employers don't want to hire transgender people, and in the state of Georgia, there are no laws to protect me in searching for employment. I suppose I could go back in the closet and find employment, but why should I have to pretend to be someone I'm not in order to get hired? Besides, I'd rather get hired with my employer knowing up front that I'm transgender. My personal life is not as complicated, although it's still not simple. My wife and I have stayed together through this, but my brother has all but disowned me, as have several extended family members. My mom is as supportive as she can be, and my dad is slowly coming around, and many of my childhood friends are sticking by me, so it's not all bad. Overall, my life is not perfect, but it could be far worse. My hope is that one day people will be able to look past things that don't really affect a person's abilities and judge them on what they are capable of instead of their appearance. To people reading this who are struggling with acceptance of transgender people, my words to you are this: open your eyes, your ears, and your mind. Let transgender people tell you about themselves instead of trying to tell us who and what you think we should be. Respect our identities instead of trying to invalidate us. And remember that we are human beings first, with brains, hearts, feelings, and families. We're not trying to lie about our bodies. We're trying to be honest about our hearts and souls. And here's a second story from Iden D. Campbell. I'm a different kind of boy, one who has had to live 2 lives before becoming one. I'm different because I was born biologically a female, raised as a female, who later in life transitioned to living as a male. I attended high school at an all-girls school in Manhattan. It was excruciating to have to pretend I was happy with my life as it was in that environment. I was constantly asked if I was a lesbian because no matter how I dress, the boy in me always showed through. Girls would always ask me if I liked them or if I wanted to kiss them, when in reality I was only crushing on Michael Jackson. The boys in my neighborhood wanted to know why my shoulders were so broad or why my hands were so big. As a kid trying to figure it all out, it was very painful trying to deal with the confusion on a daily basis. I spent most of my adulthood living androgynous, as neither male or female, dressing and behaving as genderless as possible, until reading the 2007 Newsweek article entitled "The Mystery of Gender." The article gave me a new outlook on living. I finally felt that my life could now be less painful, living as a gender I have always felt inside. The transgender community is extremely resilient. We've lived through some horrific shared experiences. The Campbell Center's beloved intern, Lasahae McLean, was murdered in 2011 because she was a trans woman. Her murder is still one of the many unsolved murders of transgender women across the country. There is hope. We remain vigilant and strong, creating resources to serve our community, such as the Trans Lifeline and Casa Ruby, the only transgender drop-in center in America's capital city. I'm thankful to all who came before me, those who made it possible for me to now live out loud in my skin. I'm grateful to be here at this amazing turning point in the history of the trans community. These two narratives suggest the changing public complexity of diverse sexual identities in the U.S. and the ongoing challenges that individuals face finding acceptance. Despite the universality of sexuality, it's a terribly complex subject that is not always easily defined or agreed upon. President Bill Clinton famously declared that he had not had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. He was making a calculated legal gamble that oral sex could be defined as distinct from intercourse. Similarly, a survey of college students at an anonymous school in the Midwest found considerable disagreements among students as to what even qualified as sex. The survey asked, "Would you say you had sex with someone if the most intimate behavior you engaged in was blank?" 2% said they'd had sex after kissing. 3% said they had after petting. 40% said they had after oral sex. And even when asked about vaginal intercourse, 99.5% of respondents felt they had had sex. This is certainly a large number, but 0.5% still said no. Despite you all knowing what sex is, we still need to define it. Anthropologist Kenneth Guest defines sexuality in two ways. First, sexuality is the complex range of desires, beliefs, and behaviors that are related to erotic physical contact, intimacy, and pleasure. Second, sexuality is the cultural arena within which people debate ideas on what kinds of physical desires and behaviors are morally right, appropriate, and natural. Guest notes that all societies, including the U.S., have to come to some sense of cultural norms and values about the topic. There's an underlying idea that sexuality is simply a natural behavior. After all human beings have to reproduce. We can't claim everything about sexuality is cultural, but it is difficult to pin down the biological roots of sexuality. For example, geneticists have been unable to identify any genes or group of genes that influence sexual orientation. We cannot deny that sexuality has biological components, but anthropologists suggest that cultural norms and values have a strong impact on sexual behavior. As part of our enculturation process, we're taught about sexuality. Our parents and our families model relationships for us. They even instruct us on the subject of sex, although the instructions may be vague. Our cultural institutions, including schools, religious organizations, and governments, also instruct us on what is proper and what is normal. We may learn that abstinence is the only way for them to avoid pregnancy, STDs, and some relationship problems. On the other hand, we may be taught about safe sex practices. Popular culture in America is extremely influential when it comes to sexuality. The behaviors and manners of dress modeled by popular singers and movie stars can have a significant impact on the behavior of others. Culture has a huge impact on sexual behaviors. Sexual intercourse between females and males is the predominant pattern within many species. Prior to the invention of in vitro fertilization, it was also how humans always reproduced. So what do we mean by the invention of heterosexuality? The term heterosexuality did not appear in the English language until 1892. In the past, Western European cultures, and in turn American cultures, were strongly influenced by cultural institutions, most notably religious institutions to view sex as for procreation only. Puritan religious groups believed that sexuality was necessary for procreation, but sex for pleasure was roundly condemned, if not seen as a sign of evil. In the 20th century, the field of sexology emerged. Studies by prominent sexologists demonstrated that erotic feelings for the opposite sex were not abnormal, but rather a normal reaction found in the majority of human beings. These scholars also found that a wide variety of sexual practices existed. These practices had been previously kept quiet. Alfred Kinsey's studies of male and female sexual behavior revolutionized our understandings of sexuality. Rather than finding distinct heterosexuals and homosexualities, Kinsey identified a continuum with exclusively heterosexual behavior on one end and exclusively homosexual behavior on the other. Most people fell somewhere along the continuum rather than at one end or the other. Kinsey's study is still controversial today among those who object to his characterization of homosexuality as natural. Kinsey's study was an incredibly open-minded study for the mid-20th century. Let's turn to a purely cultural element of sexuality: weddings. American weddings are steeped in cultural traditions. The bride must wear white, the invitations must be formally addressed, and family must be invited. Wedding ceremonies are undoubtedly a cultural construct. In her book, White Weddings, Romancing Heterosexual Sexuality in Popular Culture, Chris Ingraham traces how young girls are bombarded from birth with images of weddings and brides, and how U.S. dating culture is constructed around building a relationship that leads to a proposal of marriage from a man to a woman. Ingraham also traces the socioeconomic effect of weddings on global social lives and its global impact on workers, such as diamond workers and those who sew wedding dresses. With the increasing cultural presence of same-sex weddings in the United States, we're now seeing how some of these expectations are being transformed in partnerships without the strict traditional gender roles. Many same-sex couples engaged in commitment ceremonies before the legalization of same-sex marriage. Sexuality is related to power. It can also be manipulated in cultural power struggles. In American politics, for example, same-sex marriage has become a rallying cry for two different political perspectives. Sexual activity itself is also rife with power issues. College campuses across the nation are inundated with messages about sexual consent and avoiding rape and other sexual acts of violence. Governments routinely pass laws regarding sexuality, who can legally marry, legalizing or blocking practices such as polygamy or incest, as well as defining legal boundaries for sexuality by outlawing prostitution and legalizing pornography. Of course, sexuality is not isolated from other cultural issues. Minion Moore studied homosexuality in racial minority communities. Moore found that for most white lesbians, their sexuality was crucial to their personal identity. African American lesbians, however, felt that race was a more central part of their identity than sexual orientation. As one of Moore's informants said, "People see your blackness, and the world has affected me by my blackness since the very inception of my life. My sexuality is something that developed later on." While there are many influences on our lives, our interactions with other members of our culture lead us to hold different priorities. For many racial minorities, their racial status and its effect on their interactions with others has been of paramount importance. Globalization has had a substantial effect on sexuality around the globe. European and American governments have influenced local cultures both through colonialism and the forces of globalization. Through these contacts, new ideas about sexuality have often spread. Hollywood movies have also had major impact around the globe, transforming not only ideas of sexuality, but also conceptions about what represents beauty in both women and men. Through improved transportation technology, globalization has also made it easier for people around the world to have sexual contact. Everything from long-distance sexual relationships to sex tourism can be fostered by globalization. In closing, I'd like to return briefly to the relationship between cultural and biological dimensions of sexuality. Obviously, our species must reproduce itself biologically, usually through sexual relations. But unlike our Puritan forebears, we generally do not renounce the pleasure of sex. How many of you, for example, have engaged in sexual activity exclusively for reproductive purposes? At present, only a small percentage of U.S. Americans do not engage in premarital sex. How are we defined culturally and personally by our sexuality? How did you learn sexuality? How did you learn your own sexuality? For example, how did your parents, church, school, peers, and popular culture shape you? If you went away to college, what was the sexual culture on your campus? What about high school before that? Finally, attitudes toward sexual diversity have changed considerably in recent years. In 2004, Ohio voters passed a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. In 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ban, legalizing gay marriage in all 50 U.S. states. How have your own attitudes toward sexual diversity been shaped culturally over time? The transgender stories with which we began this presentation suggest that coming to terms with our sexual identity and our sexuality is still a difficult process. This may be as true now than in the past, especially with so many options publicly available.